The Witnesses was a puzzle game released in 2016 to very positive player feedback. The game had a very positive inception, and however, when I played it, I did not have the same experience with the game. I thought it was very badly designed and had a lot of game design issues. But I didn't have any evidence to back it up, and I was confused on why everyone that I saw reviews of really enjoyed the game. So I decided to do research on game design principles and The Witness in general. I learned a lot about game design while doing this, but I also learned a very large thing about The Witness, and that is that The Witness is a very poorly designed game. And there's a few reasons for this. But before I can get into that, I have to explain a large amount of the puzzles throughout the game, or a large amount of the puzzle mechanics throughout the game. One of the main puzzle mechanics, or the game fundamentally, is just drawing lines on grids. You just, the main task is to draw lines on grids to fulfill certain requirements. Some of these requirements include dots that need that are little hexagons that must be moved over to successfully solve the puzzle, and if they aren't, it will fail the puzzle. And and along with dots, there are also little colored squares, sometimes known as stones, that must be sectioned off into their own category, into their own sections. Otherwise, the puzzle will fail, and it will not be a successful solution. There are also a few other systems, called one that includes octograms that are eight-sided little stars that need to be isolated into a section with one other thing of the same exact color. It does not have to be an octagram, but most of the time in introduction it is. And there are also another system of puzzle element called polyanomos, which need to be in a section that is the same shape as the polyanomo. The polyanomos can also be colored, which is used very infrequently throughout the game, but is important as a game design as a mechanic later. And typically they are just an uncolored orange. There are also systems like shown of reflected lines where the line will reflect over some axes. And the there are also puzzles that are based on environmental elements where an environmental element will decide the solution to the puzzle. There are also puzzles that are based in the environment where the puzzle is based on a dot that looks like a puzzle dot throughout the area and an end that looks like an end throughout the other puzzles in the game. And those can be solved like a regular puzzle. And those are an extra challenge throughout the game. And I think those are one of the few things that I think are done very well throughout the game. They're done, for the most part, very well and at an interesting little challenge. In some scenarios, they are badly done, but for the most part, they're done very well. But the first aspect that I think the Witness does badly is priming the player. And by priming, I mean any anything that where people will recognize patterns in things. It's just what humans do. They will recognize patterns in things. So if you set up a line of puzzles like these, there is a pattern of, okay, so the line will slowly be disappearing as the levels go on. So it sets up the pattern in the player's mind that it's going to slowly fade out and that it's still going to be there, but it's just going to be invisible. So it creates a pattern in the player's mind, which primes them to expect that, and is a good method for rule learning games to introduce new mechanics. However, in a lot of situations, I feel like it's used badly, and one of these situations is for this line of puzzles. For the general gimmick is playing off of the reflective lines system, and it uses the fact that one side is yellow and requires it be solved with the actual puzzle hands, while the other side is blue and does not have the same puzzle hands. So on one side, you just input the puzzle, and then on the other side, you do the reflection. And for the first two, it is a horizontal reflection for the second puzzle, however, which primes the player to expect a horizontal reflection. However, on the last puzzle, it is both a horizontal and a vertical reflection with this little nublet. It's on the top, it's on the bottom there, and on the top here, which means that it's a vertical reflection. However, this is really subtle and difficult to notice for a player, especially if they're not readily looking for it. And this can lead to a situation where they input the code here, and then based on their pattern of, okay, it's a horizontal reflection, they will go down, go up, then go here, be a little bit confused. This is what I did, and then do the wrong puzzle, then get locked out. Because incorrectly doing this puzzle will lock you out of the puzzle until you solve the previous one, which in most situations in the game does not add anything to the gameplay experience. And in this scenario, punishes the player for falling for a trick that the developer set up. Like, there's no reasonable way for the player to notice that it is also vertically flipped also, and there's no reason for them to look out for it because they've already been primed for horizontal flips, which ends up throwing off the player and just meaninglessly punishing them for making a mistake that the dev set up for them to make. I think it could have been a much better done puzzle if instead of punishing the player, the game just show them that they're incorrect, and then let them move on. Let them realize, oh, it's also bleh, vertically flipped, and then solve it from there. This the game also makes a mistake of priming in this area because there is a puzzle that has zero priming. It is the start of this line of puzzles, and its puzzle is that it's an environmental puzzle based puzzle. Like, the puzzle is in the environment. It is, you must position yourself so that the trees show the contours of how you have to draw the line, which would be a fine puzzle if it was put at the end of the list of puzzles, because all of the puzzles on the rest are environmental based puzzles. And obviously so, because they're indicated by having the forest areas style of puzzles, and then having forest style shadow based puzzles. And then the orchard area using the same mechanics. And then it proceeds on to using more and more previously seen mechanics that are environmental puzzle based. However, this first one uses the Glass Factory aesthetics, which is the area I just showed, which uses no environmental puzzle aspects, which immediately throws the player off and makes it so that there's no indication that there is an environmental puzzle here, that you have to position yourself to make the environment look correct. Another problem with this is that the correct solution is in a bush. There's no way to position yourself for the correct solution that isn't in this bush, which immediately dissuades the player from placing themselves there because a bush is something bad. Typically in real life, you can't traverse a bush all that well. So if you if in game you're going to want to avoid the bush. You're not going to want to put yourself in a bush. However, the game forces the player to be in this bush, and it forces an unusual situation that most players don't want to do. They don't want to subconsciously, they don't want to put themselves in a bush. And this game just entirely discourages the player from finding the solution because it incorrectly indicates with the glass factory panel that it's because it's an environmental puzzle and the glass factory has zero environmental puzzles and it puts a bush on the solution. And this leads into my main source of evidence for game design principles that I'm going to use, which is a book written by a person with the last name Schell, who wrote a book about game design principles. And this book has a lot of important information about game design, as is in the name. And this book, um, and this book also has a small section for puzzle design principles. And one of these principles, the ninth one in particular, is that a puzzle should give the answer. It should hint at the answer to the puzzle, as opposed to just making it entirely obscured. Because if a puzzle hints at the solution, it makes it so that there's something to solve for the player, as opposed to what it ends up being in this scenario, that it's just you have to randomly position yourself just right in a really awkward position to see the solution. And the and if the puzzle followed the puzzle principle, it would have probably placed this puzzle near the end of the line. It could have easily been placed here, still look at the trees, and then be entirely understood to the player because the first one in the solution in the line could have been this one, which obviously indicates that it is the forest mechanic, which is entirely just shadows on grids indicating the solution, and very well indicates that this area is going to be environmental based puzzles because it uses um, panels from environmental puzzle based things. So the player would be primed after a certain point that these puzzles are based on the environment. However, the game doesn't do that, which I think is a bad idea because this puzzle took me about, I'd say, 30 minutes of staring at the puzzle or leaving and coming back to let myself think about it. And eventually I got it, but it wasn't because of any like aha moment. It was just random chance that I stumbled across it. On to the next this on to the next part I want to talk about is an area called the castle. Um, this area has two sections. One section is hedge mazes, and one section is like life-size puzzles, which the life-size puzzles area is done very well. It introduces a mechanic very well based on old puzzles and then evolves on that mechanic. However, the hedge mazes starts off well. It uses the fact that the environment of the hedge maze will determine the solution to the puzzle. Like for the first hedge maze, there are doors in the path that determine what the correct solution on the panel at the end of the hedge maze is. So you have to first navigate through the hedge maze and then solve based on some aspect of the hedge maze. This, in the first one, is doors in the hedge maze. In the second one, it is grass on the floor, which ends up being very subtle, but because you know you're looking for something that's blocking your path, you're going to be hyper analyzing this puzzle for some visual element, which makes it so the grass, however subtle, is actually surprisingly well done. However, the third one is where there's a problem because here, I'm going to turn on audio, and the mechanic is that you have to listen to the differently sounding footsteps. Like for some parts it sounds like sand, like here. And in other sections it sounds like gravel, like this. This uses audio mechanics, which I think are not done well in a large amount of situations. It is very difficult to make audio mechanics work, in my opinion, without just entirely making them replaceable with subtitles, which makes them not very audio based. But this puzzle in particular makes a very large flaw of this is the first situation in these set of puzzles where you need audio. And second, it doesn't have the typical speaker box indicator that sound is needed, which is done well in the forest area over that way, where it uses a little speaker box to indicate that the that sounds are an important part of this puzzle without directly lining it out for the player and also making it still possible for the player to figure it out. However, this one has no speaker boxes in sight and barely and uses a very quiet sound to indicate the solution to the puzzle because these footsteps easily could go unnoticed if the player has the game muted, which because very few puzzles in firstly this area and in the game in general use sound, and or they could have music playing over it, which could entirely drown out the sound of the footsteps. And it creates a very unfair experience to the player because they have to figure out um this mechanic that they have no way of knowing about because it hasn't been indicated at all throughout the game, or hasn't been indicated at all throughout the area, which creates an issue for the player and makes it near impossible for the player to solve quickly or understand. And it makes the solution feel less like an aha, I figured it out, and more of a, oh, that's okay. And that creates a problem for the player. A player should not be left to just a player's reaction to solving a puzzle should not be a, oh, that's what it was. And this creates a problem. However, I'm going to move on from that puzzle. So the next puzzles I want to talk about are in the forest area. I want to talk about something that's good in the game, which is this specific area, or this top area. This top area is done very well. It introduces a mechanic that, like, oh, you have to use audio because of this little speaker box, indicating there's audio here. I have to use my headphones and listen for I'm going to turn back on audio. You have to listen to the bird chirps that play, and if it's high, you go high. If it's low, you go low. And it lengthens the series, adds in mid notes, lengthens the series, adds in mid notes. However, this puzzle evolves badly because, firstly, it uses unpleasant sounds. Like, as you can hear as I'm walking by them, it plays really unpleasant sounds. And this culminates in this puzzle where you have to listen to bird chirps over if it plays. Yeah. You have to listen to bird chirps over so many other sounds. Typically, it's a few more. And also, it actually plays. Yeah. But You have to listen to bird chirps over phone ringing, glass shattering, gong sounds, wolf calls, and listen for a quiet little bird chirp underneath all of those. Which, firstly, the area is somewhat unfriendly to tone deaf players because you have to listen to very specific tones, which is not very friendly to a lot of players. And it also requires you to be able to discern specific sounds over others, which is something not a lot of people can do, especially in a situation like this where you're also listening to pitch of a very quiet secondary thing, which I think is another evidence as to why audio puzzles are hard to do well. Because even in the first few puzzles, pitch is hard to discern, and it's hard for some players to discern what pitch things are, unless they were to just outright say in subtitles high pitch, low pitch, mid pitch, which defeats the purpose of the puzzles, which I think makes it so that the puzzles are kind of arbitrarily defined. But that's on to another point. But overall, I think the first area of this the first section of this area was done well. However, the rest was done pretty badly. But I'm going to move on from that. And I'm going to move away from improper priming for the player. Actually, that one was moved on from improper priming of the player. And more onto just things that I think were badly done. And I want to bring up this area because this wall in particular has two puzzles right next to each other on a mechanism with the mechanism that you can close it into a colored area. And it makes it so the colored light shows different colors on the thing. Like and this one is solvable only in the colored light, while the other one is solvable only when the colored light is gone, which is a okay mechanic. It creates a little bit of an aha moment, but the big problem I have with this puzzle is that there's no indication that one of these should require light and the other should not require light, other than the game the game designer just did doth declare that it requires light or it doesn't require light. Which brings up one of the biggest problems I'd say in rule learning in for this game's rule learning aspect is that sometimes the game will just arbitrarily choose that rules aren't are different. Like for some reason this one requires light, this one doesn't, which makes it so that it's arbitrary and the rules of the stones or the little squares, the little color squares doesn't apply. The these rules can just be null and void um based on the game designer's whims, which creates a big problem because in a game like this, the the rules are the bedrock of the game. They are the basis of how the game works, which if they start changing willy-nilly, then the player can't exactly trust that the rules will stay the same, which creates a big problem a lot of for a lot of things because now you've set the precedent that rules don't really apply. They can just be arbitrarily changed just because the dev said so. Um, and this is also seen in the audio area where after a certain point of the puzzles, you have to listen to bird chirps instead of, or you have to listen to wolf calls instead of bird chirps, which changes what the player is listening to while there are still bird chirps in the sequence. And it changes the rules arbitrarily to kind of catch the player for something they couldn't have known without this failure, without failing. And it also, that puzzle in particular, doubles down on tricking the player by having that sequence of puzzles lock the player out. So, by something they literally could not have known, they get locked out and punished for not knowing it, which is unfair to the player and should not be done in puzzle games. And but I'm going to stop talking about that and move on to the next mechanic that I think was done extremely badly. It is found near the end stretch of the game. So, and the problem is that a lot of the mechanics for these puzzles is that they're hard on the eyes, is basically the mechanic for the section. Like this one is flashing lights, just very slowly, but it is hard on the eyes. And in a later section, there are constantly flashing colors, which immediately is a bad idea because constantly flashing colors are not good for a player because some people have epilepsy and cannot handle flashing colors. But the game just keeps doubling down and keeps using the flashing colors for more and more puzzles, which is not a good thing to do in games, especially because there are no accessibility options to allow for um, allow for flashing colors to not happen, which easily could have been changed by having like this one be left at like inverted colors, or all of them left at inverted colors, and this one's easier on the eyes, so I would have been fine if it stayed the way it was. But these other four are big problems because not all players can handle constantly flashing colors, which makes it unfair for certain players to get into these puzzles. And this culminates to this puzzle, which is very badly done because normally normally throughout the game the polyominoes are this colorless orange to make it so that they don't have any bounds on color rules. But in this specific scenario, which I think is about the one of the three times this mechanic is used throughout the game, the polyomino has color, which is actually necessary to notice in the puzzle because if you don't notice it, you can't pair it with this octagram, which means that you don't solve it. You can't figure out how to solve it if you don't notice that the or octagram needs to be paired with the um, polyomino, which is an interesting mechanic if it wasn't for the constantly flashing lights, which is really unfair to the player. It causes a lot of problems for players with color sensitivity and players who cannot handle that type of visuals, and it's a big problem. It's something that should have been addressed if there was playtesting, which I don't think this game had very much playtesting or didn't have diverse playtesting because a puzzle like that should not have made it through. A puzzle like that should not have made it through playtesting because it is not good. Fundamentally, it is not a good puzzle because it is aggressive on the eyes of the player and is not accessible to all players. And in playtesting, it should have been noticed if there was playtesting that this puzzle isn't friendly on the eyes and I should add accessibility options so that I can make it friendlier on the eyes. But that never happened, which I think emphasizes how important playtesting is to game development. It is really important that a game get playtested so that things that seem just fine to the developer, especially in puzzle games, because the developer is coming at the puzzle knowing the solution. And it can be very, it's very easy for a dev to make the mistake of making a puzzle that seems just fine to them, but is not just fine. But that's enough about that puzzle. I'm going to move on to this line of puzzles, where the clues to the puzzles are impossible to see. You cannot see the parts of the puzzle needed to solve the puzzle, which is not a good game mechanic because, according to the puzzle principles made by the person mentioned earlier, a if a puzzle based on puzzle principle 2, um, a puzzle should be easy to get started. This one makes it impossible to get started without running the risk of getting locked out of a puzzle, because it's been proven earlier in the game that puzzles will lock you out if you solve them incorrectly, which has been set as a precedent and has been the player has been punished before for not following that precedent, which makes it so that it is very easy for a player to be too scared. I know I was. A player being too scared to open to start these puzzles because they'll get locked out, which for some reason changes in these puzzles, which is kind of unfair to the player because arbitrarily changing things, as previously mentioned, is a bad idea. It's a bad thing to arbitrarily change rules. But this puzzle does not care, apparently, which leads to a puzzle where it's really difficult to get started. But um, the next thing I want to talk about is another one of the puzzle principles. Is puzzle principle 6. This puzzle principle is that a puzzle should give the player breaks. A player shouldn't be constantly mentally drained for puzzle after puzzle after puzzle after puzzle, because it gets tiring. Doing puzzles takes mental effort and is tiring to a player. So it is good practice to give the player a break between puzzles, which the witness often doesn't give the player a break. It will give puzzle after puzzle after puzzle after puzzle quite frequently. In some scenarios, it works well. Like for this area, it uses them to teach the player a new mechanic without them having to meander away or meander between puzzles, and they can keep the mechanic fresh in their mind while they're learning it. However, another area done very badly, in my opinion, at least with this principle, is the jungle area. Not to be confused with the forest area, but is the jungle area, where the main mechanic is octograms. You're supposed to use octograms, and the fact that they must be paired with two of the same, and they must be like that. But this area introduces a mechanic of these little platforms that are just puzzle after puzzle after puzzle after puzzle after puzzle after puzzle after every single puzzle over and over again, which creates a slog to the player, which is not good for a player if they want to take breaks, especially given that there's no new mechanics introduced throughout most of those panels, which makes it a very boring and tedious experience and also just draining to do because it's just repeated puzzles. However, it gets slightly sorry. It gets slightly worse when considering the fact that to get into this area, you have to use the slowest method of travel, the boat, which is the only method of fast travel, kind of. which ends up being one of the slowest methods of travel I've ever seen in a game, which is a problem. A player should not be forced to wait, especially for a game that boasts that they respect the player's time as precious, and because the store page says that it respects the player's time as precious and treats you as a smart player, which in some scenarios is not seen. The game will just waste your time and force you to spend time meandering around the map very slowly. But um but that might be more personal preference. So I'm going to stop talking about it because I want to try and make this video as objective as possible so that it's an actual analysis of game design as opposed to me just saying the game is bad. Because I want people to learn from this game and learn how to do better and learn how to improve on its mistakes. And the but to move on from that point, I want to bounce off of the six puzzle principle of that games should give the player a break. And I want to point out a game design flaw in this game that I think is difficult to fix. It is a difficult flaw to solve, but I think it has been done well previously or in future games that follow up on this game. And that is that the game forces you to do, or the game introduces the rule learning aspect, but then kind of abandons it halfway through. Like at the start of an area, you will be introduced to a new mechanic. It'll evolve it for a little bit, and then it'll just be solving puzzles. You'll just be solving puzzle after puzzle. Like you can see this in almost every area. Like in this area, you start off with the tree system, and then it introduces broken branches, and then just kind of becomes puzzle after puzzle after puzzle, and doesn't really introduce anything new after a certain point. But this is not exactly fun for the player because it becomes tedious. It becomes not something that the player should want to do. This is also seen in the desert area where it introduces the reflecting of the sun mechanic to show the path, and then it just becomes, can you properly position yourself in a way that makes the sun reflect properly? Which, yet again, it introduces a mechanic, then drops learning that mechanic, and just becomes solving puzzles. And because this is a difficult problem to solve. It is a problem that doesn't have an obvious solution of, oh, just make it so thing happens. But I have seen games that do it well. And the ones I want to point out are a game called Understand and a game called Bilattice. I'm going to talk about Understand first, just because I arbitrarily decided to. And the way Understand deals with this issue is that it never keeps the same rule set, but it doesn't fall into the same pitfall of arbitrarily changing rules. It definitively indicates where rule changes will occur. Like every little level is separated into its own section and has its own set of rules that you have to learn in that section, which keeps the game from just being puzzle after puzzle after puzzle. It turns the game into, okay, you're always learning more rules, which is the draw of games like these, is that you're learning more rules as you go on. So Understand solves that by changing the rules, which is a solution, but I don't think it would work for The Witness, given the open world nature and the kind of non-linearness of it. Like you do have to go to certain areas for certain tutorials, But for the most part, I don't think it would work to arbitrarily change rules, given how the game is set up. But another game does the witness format very well and also doesn't fall into the pitfall. It doesn't fall into the pitfall of just being puzzle after puzzle after puzzle. Because the game called Bilattice, will it keeps the same rule set the entire time. The rules never change, which is a good idea. That is a well done, that's a good decision for the way they wanted to do it. But the way they avoid reaching the point where it's just doing the same puzzles over and over is that they specifically make their puzzles so that each one is always introducing a new idea and is always forcing the player to think in a way they hadn't before, which which immensely um increases how non boring the game is, because you're always doing something new. You're always being forced to think in a new way. However, the witness will drill a mechanic into your brain like 20 times before it lets you say that you understand the mechanic, which is not a good way of doing it because, yet again, going back to the store page, it boasts respecting the player's intelligence and saying that the game has a new idea introduced in each puzzle, which for the rule learning aspect is true, but even in like just even in the areas I've displayed, after a certain point, it just shows you like very little evolution of the puzzle mechanics, and it doesn't push it to any real logical extremes like Bilattice does. But that's enough talking for about different games for now. For now, I will talk about other games as better examples that I think should be used as game design to do's, and this game should be used as a game design not to do. But on to the next part that I want to talk about, which um, is completion, which the completion of the game is not really indicated. The only indication that you've 100% of the game, this is a 100% save profile, is just that this number is this number. There's no other indication that you have 100% of the game. And there's no way to check or know that you have 100% of the game other than just Googling it or knowing that there are literally no other puzzles on the map that you know of. Which isn't fair to the player. A player should be able to understand that they did it. They beat the game. You've done it. You did a great job and you have played my game to 100%, and I'm proud of you, is what a game should say to the player. Or just give some indication that they've 100%ed. Like, for a game called Platonic, I'm back to talking to about other games, which I think is done very well in its puzzles mechanics, and also follows the rule learning aspect and takes it to a very high extreme, making it very difficult, but is very well done in a way that the player can logically understand it, and the game hints at its solutions. But that's enough about Platonic. The thing I want to talk about is the game ends with a credit roll, a thanks for playing, and a little secret for people who are extra observant and want to like look for secrets. The little secret is a Rickroll for spoilers for anyone wanting to solve that. But the but this just this credits roll, thanks for playing, are needed to indicate to the player you've done it. You're done. You've beaten this game. You can drop to the side, and there will not be anything to come back to unless you want to replay through the game. Which is a good way of doing it. Giving the player a thanks for playing is a very good way of doing it. I know Super Mario Odyssey, a non-puzzle game, surprisingly, um, gives the indication of a 100% profile by putting a little star next to the save profile, which is very small, but it indicates to the player, you did it. You have 100%ed me. Go to the next game in your game playing, or move on to the next thing in your life, which is a very good way of doing it. And I think this game, however, does neither of that and just says, yep, this is what you've done. I'm not going to tell you if it's 100% or not, which is rude to the player. It's rude to keep them searching for new puzzles, thinking that there is something new there, because there's no way to know that it's 100% unless you literally know that you have completed every single puzzle on this map because you know where every single puzzle on the map is, or you just look it up, which is a problem to the player. And I don't think it's done well. But I'm going to move on from that point. The next thing I want to talk about is a thing that the game does well, because I yet again want to talk about things that the game does well and not just talk about the bads. But and this is that the environmental puzzles are quite interesting at times. Like this one, this specific environmental puzzle has a nice place in my heart because you can just kind of accidentally stumble into it, and it makes it a really interesting experience to discover and find because you discover the puzzle for the first time by just walking through here, or you can just notice that, oh, that looks kind of like a bulb and it looks kind of like a path. How about I position myself just right? So it has two methods of solving it, of just stumbling upon it, or um, specifically solving for it, which both are interesting ways of solving it and are both done well. But that's what I wanted to say about environmental puzzles, is that some of them are done well. There is the eclipse puzzle, which I'm not going to talk about because that one is very subjective and can be interpreted differently based on how your interpretation of the story, which is subjective, and I don't want to get into subjective parts of the game because then I can sound opinionated. And I want this to be just purely a look at the game design. And the next part I want to look at is is this specific area. It is the beginning of the area. I started the video here. I started video down where you spawn, start the game. But at the start of the game, there is a at the start of the game there is this panel which doesn't have much on its fate. It doesn't have very much at face value because it is literally just a board where you can draw kind of whatever line you want to solve the problem. But there is a secret solution that you are given after completing the challenge Easter egg. Only There are two achievements for the game on Steam, that being complete the game and complete the challenge Easter egg. And this is the reward for the challenge Easter egg. I'm pretty sure. It's been a while since I discovered it, but I'm pretty sure that's where you get it. And by finding that, you discover this, which unlocks the Easter egg ending for the game, which is an interesting Easter egg. It I'm not going to go into the story implications because I yet again don't want to talk about the story because that is not game design. But the thing I want to point out is that this this secret is accessible from the very start of the game. The second you spawn in, you can run over there and you can run over there and get this secret. You can just immediately go here, solve, get the secret ending of the game, which is which is an interesting way to do it. I've seen this mechanic done well before, and was like, is this done well? Because it places the secret at the end of the game, making it a semi-interesting callback. But I didn't know if it was done well, or and I was just being biased, or if it was done badly and I was just legitimately observing something that was done badly. So I had to step back from the situation and I wanted to do a comparison between how that puzzle is done and the and I wanted to look at a place where a callback to the start of the game has been done well before. And the first game that came to mind was Myst with the fireplace puzzle. If you don't know, the fireplace puzzle is a puzzle at the beginning of the game that you immediately have access to and semi immediately have access to the solution. There's just a lack of information that you just need to play through the game to get. And it creates a really interesting dynamic where you always have this thing looming at the start of the game where it is like you could solve it, you just don't know the solution yet. But and eventually you get to solve this massive roadblock to beat the game after like a couple after beating the game, which takes a lot of effort. It's a very satisfying finish to a very well-made game. But I was thinking, how does this game do that differently than Myst? The main thing I think that makes the difference is what information the player is given. Because in The Witness, the player isn't tutorialed about environmental puzzles until up here, where they see this puzzle and this puzzle right next to each other, which which indicate that, oh, in the environment there are places that look like puzzles, and those can be drawn like the normal puzzles, which is a really interesting way of doing it. It makes a very like kind of thematic tutorial for a really interesting mechanic, which I think that is done well. I think the environmental puzzles in a lot of situations are done well. But the problem is that that tutorial is way up there, and thing that the secret that benefits from having that tutorial is way on the other side of the map, where this is the end of the game, that is at the dead beginning, and they are blocked by this wall. So, the player, if playing normally and not on a second playthrough, a player playing through the game won't, for the most part, won't notice that there is this secret, that this secret exists, because they have no way of knowing. They have no way of knowing that these environmental puzzles exist and that they should be looking at them. And it creates this situation where a player doesn't know that this was a roadblock throughout the game, so it doesn't create a satisfying, I have bested this thing that is sat challenging me throughout the entire time. It just creates, oh, okay. Because it might be placed at the start of the game, but you never knew that it was there because you never had that tutorial and had a reason to go back here while this was active. And I didn't even know that it was accessible from the beginning of the game until I did research for this video and replayed through the game, and I realized that it was accessible from the very start, which shouldn't be the way that a puzzle like this goes. A puzzle like this should be non it should be obvious that this is something that you can solve, but you just don't have some barrier of information, which makes this puzzle fundamentally flawed in a way. because it is impossible to do that, because to know about the puzzle, you would have to be able to solve the puzzle, which means that if you were to know that this existed, you would have to know how to solve the puzzle, which makes it so that there's no way for the player to there's no way for this to be a satisfying conclusion to the game, because the player didn't know that this has been besting them the entire game. It's just been there. But that's enough about that rant. And that's practically all of my thoughts on the Witness's game design. And I don't want this to seem like a I hate the Witness, you should never play it. I think I think this type of analysis is important to do, because from this video, I hope that people can look at how the Witness has been done badly and learn from it, and learn that priming is an important thing to consider. Playtesting is an important aspect of game design, and I want people to learn from this video about certain game design choices that have been made, certain game design mistakes that have been made in the past that shouldn't be made again, because they have been done before and they've been proven as not good. They've not been done well. And I hope that whoever's watching this can learn a little bit about game design. And firstly, not tolerate bad game design in games, and encourage devs to put in little effort when designing games. But also, I want game designers to learn from this and learn that these are mistakes that you shouldn't make, and you should do better than the Witness. You can easily do better than the Witness, I'd say. But those are all my thoughts. Thank you if you've watched to the end, and goodbye.